Okay. Well, I think we're good to go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us at today's reflections on navigating gender backlash. My name is Isabelle Mercier. I'm the director of the Independent Evaluation Office. Very happy that you're here. This is reflections are something that we do. It's part of a series where we distill lessons from past evaluations into concise, actionable products. And sometimes we do this alone, but this time we were very glad to partner with other organizations, in particular with the independent evaluation offices of UN Women and UNFPA. And of course, their rich research and expertise were key to helping shape this paper and today's discussion. And I'll start with just a few words that I'm sure just set the stage that I'm sure are not new or surprising to you. But of course, when we think about gender backlash, we understand that this isn't a new challenge. And of course, it's been going on since feminists have started to mobilize and organize. Um, However, I think you'll agree that in the current climate, this feels a bit different, and we have clear signs of it. With the rise of populism and shrinking civic spaces, anti-gender movements have a lot more influence, and they're a lot more visible than they used to be. They've grown in strength and visibility and capacity to influence public policies. And of course, we know that this isn't just rolling back progress for women and girls, it's undermining human rights and democratic practices for everybody. So here at the IEO, we decided to go deeper on the topic and understand better how the work of UNDP does by countervailing these tendencies and where instead we're constrained by them. Um, we want to help UNDP colleagues and others better understand through the use of available evidence how our institutions can respond and adapt and safeguard the gains we've worked so hard for. We hope that the paper we produce and the discussions we're having today will be thought-provoking for everyone, and that these insights will inform how we operationalize the UNDP Gender Equality Strategy, which our executive board will be discussing in June. On this note, I'm very happy to introduce and to be joined by colleagues today. Raquel Lagunas, who is the head of the UNDP Gender Equality Team. Welcome, Raquel. Douglas Webb, the resident representative of UNDP Georgia. Chaitali Chattopadhyay, a regional evaluation specialist from the UN Women Regional Office in Arab States. And I don't know if we have Gabriela yet. Gabriela Alvarez-Minte, if she's not here, she'll join us very shortly. Regional Gender Advisor from UNFPA Regional Office for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. My colleague Alice, who is an IEO senior research analyst, is the author of this paper, and she'll present the key lessons of the paper before we kickstart a discussion with our panelists and hopefully what I hope will be a very engaging and dynamic Q&A component. So over to you, Alice, for the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Isabel, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on navigating gender backlash. This paper was published by UNDP with inputs from UN Women and UNFPA. So as mentioned before, gender backlash is not new. Whenever there has been some success in feminist movements, gender backlash has resurfaced. But the backlash today has become more visible and organized. So this presents a challenge beyond only a gender issue. It's a broader threat to human rights and democratic institutions. The current global context makes evidence-based response especially important. And for the UN, this presents an important moment to reflect on what has worked, how to protect gains, and how to respond to resistance. In this paper, we define gender backlash as resistance to gender equality and women's rights, often arising in reaction to progress on these issues. And gender backsliding is referred to as the erosion or reversal of established commitments to gender equality. So what can we learn from evaluations? This paper synthesized 49 UNDP, UN Women, and UNFPA evaluation reports, including those from country program, project, and thematic and corporate evaluations. It synthesizes evidence from 2015 to 2025 with emphasis on newer evidence from 2020 onwards. The analysis was done through a combination of AI-led searches and human-led analysis. The paper distilled 6 lessons, but for the sake of time, today I'll focus on lessons 1, 4, and 5. But I would encourage everyone to visit our website and read the full paper. To prevent backsliding when political winds shifted, successful interventions anchor gender equality in statutory obligations and budgetary processes. So equitable laws or policies, those that advance and protect women's rights, were vulnerable to being diluted, weakened, or even reversed when there was a change in political priorities or the administration or a rise in resistance. So gender equality gains were more resilient and difficult to roll back when they were embedded in formal government systems. And this was strengthened when accompanied by training on gender budgeting or gender legal frameworks, which reduced knowledge loss during administrative turnovers. Institutional anchoring reduced reliance on individual champions or project funding. For example, in Kenya, UN Women helped integrate specialized courts that dealt with sexual and gender-based violence into the justice system. This meant that survival-centered approaches became a standard practice across the system, not just a pilot approach. At the same time, they introduced gender-responsive budget lines at the county level in their county governance processes, which made investments more likely to last beyond the project cycle. When central government's commitments was weak or hostile, subnational engagements or working through multi-actor networks helped safeguard progress and allow progress to keep going. Dedicated institutional bodies were most effective when backed by formal mandates with control over the budget. For example, in Nepal, an informal women's political party was dismantled after a change in the government. This shows how vulnerable these bodies can be without a legal backing. By contrast, in Georgia, UNDP, UN Women, and UNFPA supported a statutory gender institution to integrate gender equality across multiple national policies. This helped keep gender equality on the national agenda, even in the face of resistance. Reframing gender equality around national priorities secured political entry points. So we found that advocating for gender equality directly can sometimes backfire. It can be too controversial, it can detract from the main intent, or not allow any progress to move forward. Linking gender equality to messaging around economic growth, family well-being, health, or framing it around locally accepted customs made the agenda more acceptable and harder to dismiss as foreign or Western. For example, in the Philippines, women's participation in peace building initially faced resistance. But when their participation was framed in reference to the Quran, their inclusion became more justifiable and acceptable to the local customs. Reframing also helped widen the coalition by positioning gender equality as a shared priority. It also sustained progress in difficult environments and sometimes strengthened resource allocation by linking gender equality to productivity or sustainable development. However, this strategy can be risky. Reframing can instrumentalize gender equality as a means rather than an end. It was good for getting your foot in the door and gaining the initial political space, but not necessarily for transformation. This was especially evident when working with partners that did not necessarily share the same ambitions of gender equality, for example, some private sector partners, or working in a patriarchal space in general. We found that these gains were sometimes shallow, stopping at inclusion or participation and not addressing deep root causes. And these gains were also sometimes fragile, as when political priorities shifted, gender was often the first component to be dropped. This strategy was most successful when done in parallel with rights-based advocacy and social norm change. We found that gender backlash was most effectively managed not through isolated advocacy, but through multi-stakeholder and intersectional alliances. In restrictive environments, women's rights organizations and female civil society organizations were often singled out and targeted to political attacks, funding cuts, and exclusion. Bringing together diverse actors distributed the political risk and didn't make women's rights organizations a single target. This also made gender equality difficult to dismiss as a narrow agenda serving a single group. These alliances work the best when they involve people with local level influence and authority. In Malawi, for example, working with chiefs and traditional religious leaders helped shift social norms and enforce community laws on gender-based violence and early marriage. Intersectional and intergenerational approaches helped broaden support. By engaging groups across the spectrum, across age, gender, and social identity, programs are better able to address deep dynamics and shared structural barriers. That said, building and sustaining diverse coalitions takes time and effort. It requires long-term flexible funding to build trust and to withstand political volatility. And in some cases, the success of the coalition depended on the perceived neutrality of the body that was convening it. So before we end, I would like to highlight some key takeaways. First, backlash is not a temporary reaction. It's an inevitable part of what happens when the power dynamics around gender equality shift. So it needs to be anticipated and planned for. Second, successful responses are rarely based on a single tactic. They combine multiple strategies. And third, and lastly, context matters. There's no one-size-fits-all formula. Responses are most effective when they're grounded in local realities. So with this, I'll stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. Over to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Alice, for authoring the report, for doing the presentation. I hope you all found it interesting. I do encourage you to look at the full document. Again, these are things that are, I hope, going to resonate with you. But what is really interesting about this work, I think, is that it is taking what intuitively we know and validating it with evidence, and also hopefully sparking some new ideas, and articulating or making concrete some sentiments or feelings that one may have around these topics. So now it's time for our panel discussion, and we have a first question. So I'll start with looking at the current landscape and pose a question to Raquel. How have you seen gender backlash and backsliding manifesting at the global level, including in intergovernmental forums like the Commission on the Status of Women?
Thank you so much, Isabella, and congratulations to you and the Independent Evaluation Office, and to Alice and your team for the real commitment with the gender equality agenda. I personally think that the document that you have produced is going to be an incredible help for our country offices. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. Thank you for accompanying us in the implementation of our mandate. Before going maybe to the manifestation of what do we see on the ground, I wanted to reconfirm the understanding that UNDP has about backlash and backsliding as a wider global trend of the erosion of democracies, institutions, rule of law, as the backbones of the democratic society. So it's a broader umbrella, and it's very important for us to understand this from this point of view. I wanted to share few numbers and observations, like of this democratization. For instance, the Democracy Perception Index is showing that even though, and we need to keep repeating that, 85% of people still believe in that democracy is important, only 58% are satisfied with how democracy works in practice. So we think that this mistrust is deeply linked to institutions, governments failing to deliver jobs, security care, affordable housing, no, and a credible future for people. So these anti-democratic movements that have been consolidated in one global coalition alliance, all these fractions together, and they are very well funded, are capitalizing on this frustration and offering a kind of sort of false sense of order, right? A new order. And we also can see how this political polarization is pushing against gender equality through different means, and from disinformation to this putting all the stress in the democratic norms and reinforcing discriminatory stereotypes like the new fantastic housewife. So in the best worst expression, the manosphere and the backsliding in laws and policies. So for UNDP, from where we are, and we are in this global kind of global place, what we see is three manifestations of backlash and backsliding, not new, as you said. And I like a lot that the evaluation office is framing this, that this is not new. All of us, these organizations working on rights development, we have been dealing with this for decades. But there is a kind of new wave, and we see three manifestations. One is the clear contestation, questioning of broken consensus on language, agreed norms and language from intergovernmental international framework convention resolutions in intergovernmental spaces, as you said, CSW. Second, there are real rollbacks in rights protection institutions, budgets, programs, funding, and there is a third one that is an increased harassment against women's leaders, politicians, LGBTQI people, activists, and defenders of rights of civic space. There is some data points that I wanted to mention. Nearly 1 in 4 governments globally have reported backlash on women's rights in 2024. UN Women, probably our colleague will mention that, is also noting how some countries have defunded and undermined the national gender architecture, institutional architecture, women's machineries, programs funding, including violence against women. So we know that a survey of 158 women's rights defenders found that 3 out of 4 had faced threats of harassment and increase versus previous years. And what is even more interesting and is more a qualitative dimension of the backlash and backsliding is how perception-based surveys are showcasing how young men, also some women, we cannot but young men believe that gender equality, definitely efforts have gone so far and are threatening traditional masculinity models. So more specifically across regions, we see how the gender concepts are questioned. We saw projects rejected because of the gender language, including the word gender marker, which is the tracking mechanism to identify and monitor the resources that we invest in the gender equality, women's empowerment agenda. Even in the word gender, there are more countries pushing back to see this language in programs, projects, and CPDs, country program documents even. We see attempts to reintroduce discriminatory legislation with a special emphasis against LGBTQI rights, plus rights, and sexual and reproductive rights. Our colleague from UNFPA may elaborate by far more. And definitely dismantling in some countries of the institutions supporting women's rights and GBB, rollback of affirmative actions, shrinking of women's representation in politics. There is a real going down trend based on violence, this race of violence against women politicians. Online is a new dimension, the new technology-based violence against women that are in the public arena. And in terms of CSW, and I know I need to finish because it was very, very short intervention, on CSW, definitely what we learned is the rollback is not isolated anymore, it's not marginal, it's here and it's going to stay for some time. We cannot say how long. It's part also of the crisis, and I wanted to say that of the multilateralism, the questioning of multilateralism. So we need to connect the dots. We saw how, for the first time, conclusions were adopted by vote, first time ever, rather than consensus. There is a shift from negotiation progress towards a horizon line to defending the basics. Even member states who voted in favor of agreed conclusions, many formally dissociated from different parts of the text. The most controversial are non-news, the ones linked to SRHR, intersectionality, and anything that may give kind of some controversial, ambiguous interpretation. There was also an attempt to reframe this long-standing terminology, agreed terminology on gender, and concentrate the work on gender only on women and girls, redefine the work on gender equality under only women and girls umbrella, which will be, if it didn't succeed, but it can be an incredible rollback here. But the voting of this particular resolution attracted significant support. So we saw from this isolated against the language towards a movement that is growing. Agree with Isabella, and I close here, it's not a passing moment, it's a structural change in our operating environment. And I just wanted to say two things. As UNDP, we are piloting, almost finishing at the end of the year, a gender backlash backsliding monitor system in 3 countries to track changes in laws, policies, budgets, and institutions using official evidences, documents. Why? Because there is not one single global tracker. When we ask how many laws, how many budgets, we do not have a number with this specificity. And second, our main effort is invest in public institutions because they are the custodians of public policies and services, and that's what we need definitely to help countries to improve. Thank you so much, Isabella, for counting on us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel. I think you've painted a very sobering reality, and thank you for ending it on a slightly positive note of what we're doing and what you are doing, rather, in this space to help at least preserve what's left and perhaps change the discussion to something that is a little bit more forward-looking. So seems pretty clear that addressing gender backlash and backsliding is something that we have to be really equipped for. And I'll turn the next question to Douglas, who will talk, hopefully be able to give us some advice on practical tactics that he's found most useful in navigating gender backlash, whether through framing, partnership, building, communication, use of evidence. Over to you, Douglas.
Hi, Isabel. Hello, everybody. Yes, we wanted to not sort of wallow in self-pity here, but try and figure out what are the sort of ways forward and tactics in this conversation, remembering that, promotion of gender equality to one person is an attack on sovereignty, family values, and tradition to somebody else. And, speaking from the perspective of Tbilisi here, Georgia, this is a highly inflammatory conversation, a political conversation, fundamentally. And this conversation in terms of promotion of gender equality is inevitably characterized as a foreign domestic discourse, foreign or foreign funded specifically, versus the protection of some kind of sacred space of tradition, not a space really characterized by rational conversation. So reframing, just to sort of go back to the question, is an essential tactic if we're going to go anywhere with this. Not that rights are discarded as a starting point, but really having to sort of understand rights in practice, perhaps as an entry point. So we've just developed a new cooperation framework, UN cooperation framework. And actually the ability of the UN to sort of sit together and from their own mandate perspective, say why equality in practice is important, was an important point. So national counterparts would have had to come up with arguments. They wanted us to drop the idea of gender equality from the cooperation framework, just actually remove the phrase, which would have been problematic for all the CPDs, which were also coming up. And the fact that we sort of said no and stood our ground and said why was pretty important. And the fact that we did it together was a pretty important point as well. And reframing it meant looking at equity and equality within practical terms, in terms of economic opportunities, access to justice services, environmental sustainabilities, overall community well-being. And the idea of leaving no one behind actually resonated or resonates still, bizarrely, whereas human rights itself would be more problematic. And actually, in many ways, they are fundamentally, in principle, the same thing. So using differential language to mean the same things, we found a useful tactic. And actually, the ideas and narratives around entrepreneurship, economic growth, are actually highly valued and promoted narratives at the moment. So equal opportunity for women in economic growth or entrepreneurship is welcomed on all fronts, for example, and legally protected at the same time. A second sort of tactical arena has been, as implied here, is data and information. And rather than sort of sitting on a high horse and morally waving at UN commitments and international documents, which are themselves seen are actually resisted because of being part of some global deep state, which is somehow nefarious. Point to local data, point to local information. We've used e-monitor and AI systems, for example, looking at gender-based violence, online violence against women, using technical assistance from the Korean National Police Agency, for example, here in Georgia, working with local civil society, working with UNFPA, UN Women and others, doing similar things, which has revealed very important patterns of risks, which has informed policy and provided data sets which themselves can provide starting points for conversation with local state authorities, and not ideological battlegrounds, but real world cases which require attention and resources. And there are myriad examples of that, and I see ears online from our office who could talk to this all day long, but essentially come up with data and surveys and behavioral surveys and CAP studies, as we used to call them, which are statistically significant and require sober interrogation, and don't come in with a rights discourse, because that would immediately be thrown in the bin. Thirdly, and finally, I think the idea of partnerships and sort of discussions within those partnerships is an obvious one, but it's important, and we found it very useful. Go outside of the capital, go to the margins, go to the municipalities. And we found that extremely useful, not because it's a good thing to do in and of itself, but it rebuilds trust at local levels with organizations, civil society partners who often feel that they're left out and don't get listened to enough. We have a joint program around promoting and protecting civic space. We have a good joint program within that with UN Women, for example, where we've sat down with 120 odd organizations at a subnational level, looking at gender issues within civic space as a mainstreamed issue, not itself gender equality as an issue, but gendered civic space and issues within local environments which require development attention with gender as a lens. And that has rebuilt trust that we're talking to local organizations from their level around issues that they care about and designing programs from the bottom up. And they've said, you guys don't do this very often. What's happened? Why are you coming down to talk to us? You usually just throw requests for proposals at us. Something's changed. And actually, we're just returning to good development practice. And it's reinstigated trust in a development practice, but also mainstreaming gender in a non-threatening and in a politically hostile environment, which has dissipated the operational risk in a way that's allowed us to function unimpeded. And this is not just us new women, but across the system as well. So those are, I think, 3 tactics and a pile of tactics that we could talk about. I think those are 3 that have come to mind. Thanks, Isabel.
Thank you so much for that, Douglas. I was taking a lot of notes. It's really interesting and very happy to hear that you are navigating this space effectively. I'm particularly interested in that word, that moving from ideological battlegrounds to really, finding practical solutions to real problems in this space, reframing it and finding and working with partners to build trust. Fantastic. All right, so now we'll move to our partners, our colleagues in UN Women and UNFPA. Same question for both of you. How have you navigated movements that undermine gender equality and justify backlash through social and cultural norms? Let's start with Chaitali.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and morning and afternoon, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. Let me start off by emphasizing that responses to gender backlash are shaped by context, timing, and associated risks. In contexts where some democratic and civil space still exists, so that the feminist civil society organizations can organize themselves and institutions such as parliaments, court, or national women's machineries retain certain degree of autonomy, responses to backlash can be more direct or confrontational and can therefore focus on openly defending legal and normative gains using advocacy, litigation, accountability mechanisms, and public pressure to resist rollbacks and challenge anti-gender narratives. By contrast, in contexts that are marked by criminalization or securitization of gender equality, shrinking civic space, and high risks to women human rights defenders, the strategic response have been towards survival, holding the line and protecting the remaining space. Gender equality work is therefore often pursued indirectly, such as through service delivery, humanitarian response, livelihood, or social protection. With that framing in mind, I will be very briefly highlighting 4 strategies that we have observed through the research and evaluation lens that has worked in the context of the countries and the regions we work in. The first one is supporting intersectional and diverse feminist networks and movements to counter coordinated gender backlash. When feminist movements are connected across race, ethnicity, territory, sexuality, or gender, they are better able to provide more meaningful, timely, and collective pushback. Brazil is a good example where UN Women supported coalition building across the Black women's movements, indigenous, Quilombola women's organizations, feminist collectives of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and youth-led networks. This collective approach proved quite effective in resisting the targeted attacks on the reproductive rights, gender-based violence policies, and social protection measures, particularly during the period of 2019 to 2022. At the same time, it is equally important to emphasize that in far more restrictive contexts such as Afghanistan, evaluative evidence shows that sustaining partnership with women-led organizations through institutional, financial, and technical support proved critical to just preserving the fundamental fabric of women's voice and collective agency. The second one I want to emphasize on is protection and support for women human rights defenders, or WHRDs. They remain at the forefront of the struggle for rights, equality, and justice, and often operate under severe threats, particularly in conflict, post-conflict, and humanitarian settings. They need financial, legal support, physical protection to continue their work. And the traditional financing mechanisms often overlook individual activists or smaller grassroots organizations. In this regard, the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, called WPHF, which is a UN trust fund hosted by UN Women, launched a dedicated funding window for WHRDs in 2022 in partnership with OHCHR. The window provides both rapid response and longer-term funding to WHRDs to ensure their protection and enable them to continue their vital work. As of June 2025, nearly 920 WHRDs and 2,700 of their dependents have received support through window. Our evaluative evidence has shown that this has been one of the most effective ways of supporting and protecting the WHRDs. The third strategy I want to talk about is designing interventions that are firmly grounded in an understanding of local power dynamics and cultural norms. This involves identifying and intentionally engaging community and family power brokers, such as religious leaders, community leaders, male head households, working with them rather than bypassing them. And the evaluative evidence has shown that this approach has worked in multiple contexts. Alice has referred to Malawi, so Malawi, Ethiopia, Kyrgyzstan, where engagement with faith leaders and religious institutions has helped to reduce backlash, increase legitimacy, and shift perception of gender-based violence from a private, intimate issue to a collective social harm. Approaches have included strengthening the capacity of the religious clergy, using faith-based narratives to challenge the normalization of intimate partner violence, and supporting the development and enforcement of community bylaws to address gender-based violence. And the final one that Douglas also has touched upon is generating evidence to capture the lived realities and utilizing them for policy advocacy and reform. We get evidence from countries like Moldova and Afghanistan, where with the help of local women's organizations, the violence against women has been systematically documented and presented for policy changes. For instance, in case of Moldova, in the context of rising online violence against women, the civil society organizations documented the manifestation of gender-based violence, patterns of hate speech, timings, and how these are acting as barriers to women's political participation. The evidence supported the development of legal provisions, such as updates to the electoral code to sanction hate speech and discriminatory rhetoric during campaigns. So these are some of the ways in which we see UN Women navigating through this space, and we can talk about it more during our Q&A. Over to you, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very interesting to hear about all those efforts and initiatives. Same question to you, Gabriela.
Thank you, Isabel. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective. And I want to sort of bring us back to both what Douglas and Raquel were saying at the beginning. So thinking about where does the pushback come from? Manifestation and the different manifestation of the pushback and what it means for UNFPA. So I want to draw maybe your attention how the pushback comes from it's coming from different fronts and not necessarily the traditional fronts. So one of the issues that UNFPA have been working on is to look at the demographic anxieties of the governments in the region, in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia region, in two ways. One is a sort of evidence-based understanding of how many of the policies to address demographic anxieties has meant a pushback to gender equality, to SRHR, and to women's empowerment and bodily autonomy. But also thinking how to shift that narrative and how to engage with countries in the region to make this, to support countries address demographic anxieties that are based in human rights and equalities, all types of equality, but particularly gender equality. And therefore, we are working on what we call the demographic resilience program that I will not dwell on, but it's a good example of how areas that traditionally may not be thought about having a strong component of pushback to gender equality and rights have and may have a component of pushback. The other element that I want to highlight from this example is that, we need to understand then where the power lies and how the the power of the pushback is now in a different or in a more strong space within policy making and states, an authoritarian state, as Raquel was saying at the beginning. So there is a combination of factors here that drives the pushback, and for us is to understand very critically, you know, where is the power of the pushback and how we can navigate this. The third element of this example that I want to give you is that it's also a sort of opportunity for us to find a common space that allow us to address issues that are of interest on maybe more conservative actors, but where we can influence and advocate for a more human rights and equality-based implementations. And this means looking at, as Douglas was saying, you know, what is of interest to you? Is it women's employment? Is it, you know, fertility rates? Is it the population, et cetera, et cetera? However, it also means that we as UN need to be very, very clear on where we stand. Where do we stand in this narrative in terms of gender equality and rights? Where do we stand in this narrative in terms of how we see families, diverse families, equal families, etc.? So this example I'm giving you, and we're using it across the region, is sort of how you can address a middle ground and how you can ensure that the policies that are going to be implemented anyway, because they are of concern of governments in the region, how we can try and make an effort to ensure some elements of equality and rights within these. So it's a sort of an example of reframing narratives with a gender lens and a rights lens. However, my final point is I think it's really interesting. What is really interesting about the documents that you guys shared with us is that you clearly said the limitations of this approach. You say in this document, and it's in page 11, that this opens spaces for advocacy. We see that. It opens spaces for interactions, for influence. However, it also limits the transformative potential of gender equality and rights. And I think for us, this is key. And for this group, I mean, not for us as UNFPA, for us as the UN, this is a key conversation. Where are red lines? You know, how can we continue the conversation with more trying to address the pushback and to sort of do damage control without losing the transformative potential that the United Nations should have in transforming societies and narratives around women's equality and rights. So yeah, I think that's my point. Also because the role that the UN has, and this is my final point, is also in a shaky position. The multilateral system overall and the capacity that we have to monitor commitments to gender equality and rights is in not the same stance that we were in the early 2000s. So what does it mean for us then? And I will end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, and thank you to all the panelists. So now we do have some time. We have about a quarter of an hour for discussion. We do have a Q&A section here. It's if you look at your screen, it's right, well, on my screen, it's right beside the little chat. I don't know if it appears differently on different screens. Feel free, if you're feeling a little bit shy and you don't want to raise your hand and talk, feel free to please put a question there for our panelists. Also, please raise your hand if you want to ask the panelists anything. I know I have a million questions, but I may save mine until I see if other people are wanting to raise some questions. Also, if the panelists want to react to anything that the other panelists have said, please feel free to let me know. I'm going to wait just a little bit because I know it may be intimidating to ask the first question. Josephine, brave woman. Over to you.
Thank you so much. To all the panelists, it's been very interesting to listen to your thoughts on how we should reframe and move towards and protect the issues around gender backlash. My question goes to Gabrielle. I just wanted to learn more from you in terms of reframing the narrative of of gender equality and human rights in the face of the backlash, given the financial case now that we are facing as UN, and we have lost like a lot of staff that have gone that had all this wealth of wisdom and knowledge. How best can we reframe and still push the pushback and move with that narrative, especially navigating the financial landscape that we are being thrown at? Thank you.
Gabriela?
I see another hand. So I was
sorry, I see it too. All right,
Claudia.
that's Claudia, yes.
Hi, thank you. Claudia Pamela from Mexico. And I have two questions. One of the questions is, I was really interested, well, awesome interventions. Thank you so much. And one of them is about the monitoring tool that I think Raquel Lagunas mentioned it. Like, I would like to know in which countries, I think you said 3 countries are like maybe doing something about monitoring, or if it is like an index of backlash that you're developing. I'm really, really interested about it. Because here in Mexico, we're starting to work with the e-monitor. So I'm just curious if it is like with a tool, like an tool that observes what is posted online, or if it is more like an diagnosis of laws in countries, something like that. And another question that I have is that also, I think, sorry, I don't recall the name of the last man that had an intervention that spoke about the how it is observed also the online violence against women. So I'm also interested on knowing how are you doing that on crimes, for example, with the Korean department, because we're also being asked to do that in Mexico, but it's really hard. But it is like a really nice way to also make like to scope the idea of having like a more detailed object, because when we are researching about digital violence, we haven't thought about mixing it with backlash in gender. So it will be really interesting if you could like tell some more about how you're doing it. And I'm really excited about knowing more about this. I know that you also share like a gender cop about this information in an online, I mean in an email. So we're really excited that people are doing this, because we really need it. Also here in Mexico, we're having, maybe in Mexico, we don't have that many laws that are being changed, but we are facing a huge amount of gender backlash due to our proximity to another countries that are doing it. So it is really changing the way society is thinking about gender and human rights a lot. So it is really interesting what you're doing, and I'm really excited to know more about what is happening. So thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions and for letting us know a little bit about your situation in Mexico. I'll turn to Gabriela first to respond to Josephine's question.
Okay. Yes. So I think on reframing the narrative, I think there's two two ways of looking at it. One is, how do we reframe and find the entry points when we talk about gender equality and rights? Yeah, and that's a case-to-case basis. As Douglas was saying, you need to find your entry points when you have your counterpart on the other side, and see how you can maybe talk about the same issues, but with a different narrative, with a different way of saying this. And the other thing that I think it's important that we don't discuss a lot is that how do we engage with narratives that are not necessarily about gender with a gender lens? And this is when I talk about demography and demographic resilience, which are not necessarily issues that traditionally we look at them with a gender lens or a rights lens. And for us, what we're doing is we're introducing gender equality and rights into the discussions on demography, on fertility, and etc., which means sort of a really unpacking what it means. What does it mean when we talk about fertility or family aspirations from a gender equality and rights perspective? And so we're sort of unpacking that. But I think my final point is, I think, because what you were saying, Josephine, about the shrinking space internally within the UN, the shrinking resources, the financial constraints, I think it's time that the agencies that are not only gender focused sort of put their heads above the water, and the narratives around gender equality are really mainstream across the different areas of work. Like traditional population and development was not necessarily about gender equality and rights. We need to start talking about gender equality and rights. I don't know, UNDP, traditional areas where the narratives were not necessarily about gender equality and rights now need to include gender equality and rights, because this is how we can maintain these principles there. Otherwise, and we are not doing a service to ourselves to put all the responsibility and the burden of change in gender advisors, gender project, and gender people. It needs to be more cross-cutting, more now than ever, because we don't have the resources not to be cross-cutting, not to be mainstream, and not to have a very clear narrative what it means for the other areas that we work. Where are our red lines? What are the things that we're not going to accept in other areas of work? Not necessarily, you know, the traditional gender people talking about gender and women's rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. Very interesting insights. Next question, Claudia's first question was about the monitoring tool. Raquel, can you give us a bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And I think the colleague leading in the gender team this work is in the webinar. So it is Carolina Rivera. So she may want to jump here and talk much better than me. The original idea that we had is, as I said, track changes in legislation, national laws, budgetary weakening through different means, but official ones. So it can be evidence-based, as we are discussing here, through decrees, executive branches, regulation, official resolutions. This is kind of the broad context, but in every country, they have tailored their own monitoring tracking system and early warning system. Because we wanted to do both, to identify which are the indicator or signals that can help to see a backsliding coming and backlash, but also the tracking and monitoring of what is already going backwards. And there are different answers from the 3 pilots that, if you allow me, I'm not going to share the countries here, because some of them prefer to have this a little bit in the kitchen, because obviously different pressures on the environment. But I give you my email, you write me, and I put you in contact with the people who is working on that, so you can always have answers. What we are really trying to monitor is first discursive legitimization, dismantling of policies, reframing of the policies that sometimes there is a sort of camouflage under the reframing of the policies, a reinterpretation, and suddenly we have a policy concentrating in affirmative action for women becomes on families, and weakening of implementation mechanisms, that it's also very clear how you can have the policy in countries, they remain, but they kind of downgrade how the policy is implemented. And this is another way of another backsliding indicator. Erosion of participation and accountability. Participation and civil society spaces is another aspect and dimension that we wanted to monitor, and we are providing this guidance to countries, and digital, social media, and public opinion. But again, more information with colleagues who are leading this work. And if my colleague Carolina wants to jump, please feel free under Isabel's moderation. So thank you. It's up to you, Isabel.
Thank you so much, Raquel. I think we only have a few minutes left, so if you don't mind, we'll move to Douglas. First question from Claudia was about a little bit more on, you had mentioned an example of using local data, as an example on data of violence against women. I think Claudia wanted to know a little bit more about that. But there is also a question in the chat. Douglas, have you seen the question? Yeah, okay. So perhaps I'll let you address both Claudia and Maria's questions.
Yeah, I was just typing the answer to a question, but I'll finish it. Yes, this issue of responding to government across the table, not easy at all. It really isn't. We weren't hampered by the restriction of government co-financing. I should say that straight away. So we weren't jeopardizing, we weren't giving up money in that respect or threatening our own funding source. A lot of countries would have that problem. So we weren't being blackmailed. We reminded government of of its own constitution and the language in the constitution, and basically said that what they would be doing in the backsliding arena was essentially unconstitutional. And then we basically pointed out all of the commitments that had already signed up to, and implied that this would be a remarkably hypocritical move on their part. And when we were countered with the idea from their side that gender equality had already been achieved, which was a remarkable claim, we countered it quite politely with data proving that that was not the case. So in a sense, because this was a political maneuver, not a evidence-based one, we countered it in the end without too much trouble. And because the people we were talking to across the table were not making decisions, in that respect, it went up the chain. And then in the end, we won that little battle, but it took months and months and months. Now, on the question of the Korean support to online gender-based violence, my colleague Anna Lobshinadze is online, and if it's okay, Anna can answer this question very quickly and much better than I could if Anna's there, because she managed that work.
I'm here.
Anna, please.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion. And about the Monitor Plus, this was AI-powered monitoring system developed through collaboration UNDP and KNPA. It was designed to detect and analyze harmful online content, including TFGBV, sexist and homophobic hate speech, disinformation, but in the Georgian language, which made it harder because it was implemented in 2024. And it installed AI-based monitoring tool. We used Azure, and alongside capacity building trainings were done for the monitors. And key achievements of this project was improving the system's ability to recognize the Georgian language expression of hate speech and online abuse through localization. But I would love to share more on my email as well, because we don't have much time here. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you for the effort, help. We are coming up on time. And it gives me just enough time to thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your interventions. I wish we had more time to hear from you. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. I encourage you all to continue this dialogue and exchange on the gender community of practice. And please do read the report. I hope you find it useful. It's a short read. I hope it's an interesting read for you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.